The tear-stained face of Adelaide Vale was barely visible through the thin veil that covered her face, but everyone at the auction could see her trembling. It was 1875 in the harsh mining town of Randsburg, California, and human decency seemed as scarce as water in the surrounding Mojave Desert. Adelaide stood on the crude wooden platform, head bowed, her hands bound before her with coarse rope that cut into her delicate wrists. $500 for this fine specimen of womanhood, shouted the auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth named Silas Barrow. A proper lady with education, suitable for any man needing a wife or housekeeper. Do I hear 500? Adelaide wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but where would she go? Her father's debts had sealed her fate, and now she was being sold to pay them off, a practice still occurring in the lawless corners of the West, despite being wholly illegal. She had arrived in Randsburg only 3 weeks ago, hoping to start anew after her father's death, only to discover he had borrowed heavily from the town's most ruthless businessmen. 400 then. Surely this delicate flower is worth 400. The crowd of miners, drifters, and businessmen eyed her hungrily. Some were looking for wives, others for something far less honorable. Adelaide closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. At 22 years old, she never imagined her life would come to this. $450 from Mr. Hargrove, the auctioneer announced, pointing to a corpulent, sweating man in his 50s who owned the largest saloon in town. Adelaide felt ill at the thought of being handed over to him. 500. Called another voice, belonging to a thin, sour-faced man with a cruel smirk. Just as the bidding intensified, a commotion at the back of the crowd drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted, making way for a tall figure moving purposefully toward the auction platform. What's the meaning of this? The deep voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. A man stepped forward, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his Stetson, but his posture conveyed authority that made even the auctioneer hesitate. "Just a debt auction, Mr. Rowland," Silas explained nervously. "Legal business." The newcomer climbed the steps to the platform in 2 long strides. His spurs clinked softly against the wooden planks. Now Adelaide could see him clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind but still handsome, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her veil. He couldn't have been more than 30. "There's nothing legal about selling a human being," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the now silent crowd. He turned to Adelaide and his expression softened. With gentle hands he lifted her veil. "What's your name, Miss Adelaide Vale?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. He nodded once, then turned back to the crowd. "This auction is over." "Now see here, Rowland," protested Hargrove, stepping forward. "I've already bid good money," I said, the man repeated, his hand moving subtly toward the gun holstered at his hip. "This auction is over." The crowd shifted uneasily. Everyone in Randsburg knew Daniel Rowland, the owner of the successful Silverline Ranch outside of town. He rarely came into Randsburg, but when he did, people listened. "The lady's father owes debts," Silas argued weakly. "Almost $1,000. Daniel Rowland reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded stack of bills. He counted out several $100 notes and thrust them at the auctioneer. "This should cover it with interest," he said coldly. "And if I ever hear about another human auction in Randsburg, I'll make sure the federal marshal pays a long visit to this town." He turned to Adelaide and with a small knife cut the ropes binding her wrists. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he examined the raw, red marks they had left behind. "Come with me, Miss Vale," he said softly. "You're safe now." Adelaide looked up at him, uncertain. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." For the first time, a small smile crossed his face, softening the hard lines. "Because from now on, you'll only know joy." The words were simple, almost too simple for the gravity of the situation, but something in his eyes told Adelaide he meant them. With nowhere else to turn and her heart still racing from the horror of the auction block, she allowed him to lead her down from the platform. As they walked away, the crowd parting silently before them, Adelaide felt the stares of the townspeople boring into her back. Her legs trembled so badly she feared she might collapse, but Daniel Rowland's steady hand at her elbow kept her upright. "My wagon is just down the street," he said quietly. "Can you make it that far?" Adelaide nodded, gathering what remained of her dignity. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Rowland." "Daniel," he corrected gently. They reached a well-maintained wagon with 2 strong horses harnessed to it. Daniel helped her onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the town center, Adelaide finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. "Where are we going?" she asked, suddenly aware that she was placing her trust in a complete stranger. "To my ranch for now," Daniel replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "Unless you have somewhere else you'd prefer to go." Adelaide shook her head. "No, I have nowhere." The admission hurt, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. "Then you'll stay at Silverline until you decide what you want to do," he said simply. "I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Hathaway, who will see to your needs." As they rode out of town, Adelaide stole glances at her rescuer. Daniel Rowland was not what she would have expected from a rancher in this rugged land. Despite his weathered appearance and the practical, dusty clothes he wore, there was something refined about him in his speech, in his bearing. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked as the town receded behind them. "Pay my father's debts, I mean." Daniel was silent for a long moment, the only sound the steady clop of hooves and creaking of the wagon wheels. "I've seen too much suffering in this world to stand by when I could do something about it," he finally said. "What they were doing to you wasn't right. But $1,000. Adelaide breathed. It was an enormous sum. A small, wry smile touched his lips. "Silverline does well enough." "And money is just money, Miss Vale. A person's dignity is worth far more." They traveled in companionable silence for the next hour, the landscape changing from the dusty streets of Randsburg to rolling hills dotted with sage and scrub. Eventually, a sprawling ranch came into view. Neat fences, several outbuildings, a large barn, and a 2-story house that looked surprisingly substantial for this remote area. "Welcome to Silverline," Daniel said as they approached. 2 ranch hands came running to greet them, looking curiously at Adelaide but asking no questions as Daniel helped her down from the wagon. "Is Mrs. Hathaway in the house?" Daniel asked one of the men. "Yes, sir, preparing supper." Daniel nodded and guided Adelaide toward the main house. It was a handsome structure built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Inside, the house was clean and well appointed, if simple polished wooden floors covered with quality rugs, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. "Mrs. Hathaway," Daniel called. A plump, gray-haired woman appeared from what Adelaide assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyebrows shot up at the sight of Adelaide. "We have a guest," Daniel explained. "This is Miss Adelaide Vale. She'll be staying with us for a while. Miss Vale, this is Mrs. Hathaway, who keeps this house running and keeps me from living like a complete savage." The older woman's face immediately softened into a warm smile. "Welcome, Miss Vale. You look like you could use a hot meal and a good rest." "Thank you," Adelaide said, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness after the day's events. Her legs finally gave out and she swayed on her feet. Daniel caught her elbow, steadying her. "Mrs. Hathaway, Miss Vale has had a difficult day." Perhaps you could show her to the guest room and help her get settled." "Of course," the housekeeper replied, her keen eyes taking in Adelaide's disheveled state and the raw marks on her wrists. "Come with me, dear," as Mrs. Hathaway led her up the stairs. Adelaide glanced back to see Daniel watching her with concern in his blue eyes. "Thank you," she said again. Unable to find words adequate for what he had done, he simply nodded. "Rest now. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." In the guest room, which was more comfortable than any place Adelaide had stayed since leaving her childhood home in Boston, Mrs. Hathaway fussed over her like a mother hen. She drew a bath, found clean clothes that had belonged to Daniel's sister during her last visit, and promised a hot meal once Adelaide was refreshed. Left alone, Adelaide sank into the warm bathwater and finally allowed herself to process the day's events. She had nearly been sold like cattle. If not for the intervention of a stranger, what would have become of her? The thought brought fresh tears, but she wiped them away resolutely. She had cried enough. Now she needed to figure out what to do next by the time she joined Daniel and Mrs. Hathaway for supper. Adelaide felt more like herself. The borrowed dress was a bit large but clean and proper, and she had managed to arrange her chestnut hair into a simple but neat style. "You look much better," Daniel observed as she entered the dining room. "I feel much better," Adelaide admitted. "Mr. Rowland, Daniel, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." "No thanks necessary," he said, standing to pull out her chair. "I only did what any decent person would do." "But most didn't," she pointed out quietly. They all stood there watching, bidding. A shadow passed over his face. "That's unfortunately true. Randsburg can be a hard place." Over a simple but delicious meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh baked bread, Adelaide found herself telling them her story, how her father had moved them from Boston to San Francisco after her mother's death, how his business ventures had failed one after another, and how after his death 3 months ago, she had discovered they were destitute. "I came to Randsburg because I had heard there were opportunities for work here, with all the mining operations," she explained. "But when I arrived, I was confronted by Mr. Hargrove, who claimed my father had borrowed heavily from him during a visit last year. He produced papers with my father's signature." She looked down at her plate. "When I couldn't pay, he said he would recover his money one way or another." "That's not legal," Daniel said firmly. "Even if your father did owe the debt, you can't be held responsible that way." "I've discovered there's quite a difference between what's legal and what happens in places like Randsburg," Adelaide replied wryly. Daniel smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face and made him look younger. "You're absolutely right about that, Miss Vale. Please call me Adelaide." After supper, they moved to the sitting room where Daniel poured small glasses of sherry for them. Mrs. Hathaway excused herself to finish the kitchen work, leaving them alone. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked, settling into an armchair across from her. Adelaide sighed, cradling her sherry glass. "I don't know. I had hoped to find work as a teacher or perhaps as a clerk in one of the businesses. I'm well educated. My mother insisted on that before she passed. But now you worry your reputation might be compromised by today's events," Daniel finished for her. "Exactly." She looked up at him. "And I have nowhere else to go. No family, very little money of my own." Daniel considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Stay here for a while," he suggested. "Randsburg isn't the only town in the area. Once things settle down, we can look into opportunities in Barstow or even San Bernardino." "That's very generous, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," he interrupted gently. "Silverline is a big house, and to be honest, it gets lonely sometimes. Mrs. Hathaway would appreciate the female company, I'm sure." Adelaide studied him, trying to understand this man who had so unexpectedly come to her rescue. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Daniel set down his glass and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "When I said you would only know joy from now on, I meant it. Not because I have any expectations or demands, but because no one should suffer what you almost did today." He paused. "I've seen too much cruelty in this world, Adelaide. When I have a chance to counter it with kindness, I take it." There was something in his voice, a hint of old pain that made Adelaide wonder what experiences had shaped this man. But it wasn't her place to pry, not yet. "Then I accept your offer with gratitude," she said. "And I insist on earning my keep. I can help Mrs. Hathaway or work in your office if you need assistance with accounts or correspondence." Daniel smiled again. "We'll figure something out. For now, just rest and recover." He stood. "It's been a long day. I'll bid you good night." That night, in the comfortable guest bed, Adelaide lay awake for hours, replaying the day's events. She had gone from the depths of despair to being rescued by perhaps the most honorable man she had ever met. What would tomorrow bring? For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope for the future. At Silverline Ranch, Adelaide quickly fell into a routine. Mrs. Hathaway welcomed her help in the household duties, and Daniel invited her to assist him with ranch correspondence and bookkeeping, when he discovered she had a head for numbers and elegant handwriting. The days passed in peaceful productivity, and Adelaide began to heal from her ordeal. She learned more about Daniel Rowland, too, that he had come to California after the Civil War, in which he had fought for the Union as a young officer. He had purchased Silverline 10 years ago when it was little more than a ramshackle cabin with some grazing land, and through hard work and smart business sense, had built it into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the region. 2 weeks after her arrival, Adelaide was sitting on the front porch in the evening, enjoying the cool breeze after a hot day, when Daniel joined her. "Mrs. Hathaway tells me you've been a godsend around here," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "She says the house hasn't run this smoothly in years." Adelaide smiled. "She's being kind. I'm just happy to be useful." "How are you feeling about everything, about what happened in Randsburg?" She considered the question seriously. "I still have nightmares sometimes, but mostly I feel angry. Not just at Hargrove and the auctioneer, but at my father for putting me in that position, and at myself for being so naive." Daniel nodded. "Anger is natural, but don't be too hard on yourself or even your father. We all make mistakes." "Some mistakes have bigger consequences than others," she replied softly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I've been meaning to ask," Daniel said eventually. "Do you ride?" Adelaide laughed. "Not well, I'm afraid. My mother thought horseback riding wasn't ladylike, so I never properly learned. Would you like to? This is ranching country. A person should know how to sit a horse." The idea was appealing. "I would like that very much." "Then we'll start tomorrow," he decided. "I have a gentle mare that would suit you perfectly." The next morning, Daniel met her at the stables after breakfast. He had already saddled 2 horses, a spirited bay gelding for himself and a placid chestnut mare for Adelaide. "This is Penny," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's about the sweetest tempered horse you'll ever meet." Adelaide approached the horse cautiously, holding out her hand as Daniel had instructed. Penny snuffled at her palm, then bumped her head gently against Adelaide's shoulder. "She likes you," Daniel observed with a smile. "Now let me help you mount." His hands were warm and strong as they spanned her waist, lifting her easily into the saddle. Adelaide settled herself, adjusting her borrowed riding skirt. "How does that feel?" he asked, looking up at her. "Strange," she admitted. "But good." Daniel grinned. That's a start. He checked her stirrups and the way she held the reins, making adjustments where needed. Remember, gentle pressure with your legs to guide her. Penny knows what to do, you just need to give her the right signals. He mounted his own horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, and they set off at a walk. Daniel led them along a well-worn trail that wound through Silverline's pastures, patiently instructing Adelaide on proper riding technique. By the end of the hour, she was feeling more confident, sitting straighter in the saddle and beginning to understand how to move with the horse rather than against it. "You're a natural," Daniel said as they turned back toward the stables. Adelaide laughed. "I think Penny deserves most of the credit. She's ignored all my mistakes." "She's a good teacher," he agreed, "but you're a good student." As they rode side by side, Adelaide found herself studying Daniel's profile: the strong jaw, the straight nose, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. In the 2 weeks she had known him, she had come to respect him deeply, not just for rescuing her, but for the way he ran his ranch, treated his workers, and lived his principles. Back at the stables, Daniel helped her dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a spark of awareness that made Adelaide's breath catch. Daniel cleared his throat and stepped back. "You did well today. We'll try again tomorrow if you'd like." "I would like that very much," she replied softly. The riding lessons became a daily ritual. Each morning after breakfast, they would saddle up and explore a different part of Silverline's extensive property. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, and Adelaide a dedicated student. Soon she was trotting confidently, and eventually even attempting a cautious canter. During these rides, they talked of many things: books they had read, places they had seen, their hopes and occasional disappointments. Adelaide learned that Daniel had a sister named Elizabeth who lived in San Francisco with her husband and children, and that his parents had died when he was in his early 20s, leaving him to make his own way in the world. "Is that why you came west?" she asked one morning as they rested their horses by a small stream that cut through the property. Daniel nodded, absently running his hand along his horse's neck. "Partly. And partly because after the war the East felt confining, too many memories." "Was it very terrible, the war?" A shadow crossed his face. "War is always terrible, but sometimes necessary." Adelaide sensed his reluctance to discuss it further and changed the subject. "Tell me about how you started Silverline." His expression lightened. "I arrived in California with just enough money to buy a small plot of land and a few cattle. The first years were hard: drought, rustlers, you name it, but I was stubborn." "And successful," she added. He smiled. "Eventually. It helped that I had some experience from working on my uncle's farm in Pennsylvania. But mostly it was about not giving up." As the days turned into weeks, Adelaide found herself thinking about Daniel more and more, not just as her rescuer or host, but as a man. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he mounted his horse, the deep timbre of his laugh when something amused him, the gentleness in his hands when he helped her over rough terrain during their rides. One evening in late June, about a month after her arrival at Silverline, Daniel invited her to ride into the hills to watch the sunset from his favorite spot. They packed a simple picnic: bread, cheese, fruit, and a bottle of wine, and set off in the golden late afternoon light. The spot Daniel had chosen was perfect: a small clearing on a hillside overlooking the entire valley, with Silverline Ranch visible in the distance and the mountains rising majestically beyond. "It's beautiful," Adelaide breathed as they spread a blanket on the ground. "I come here to think sometimes," Daniel admitted, uncorking the wine. When decisions need making or problems need solving. And does it help? She asked, accepting the cup of wine he offered. Usually, it's hard to stay troubled when faced with all this. He gestured to the panoramic view. Reminds me how small our problems really are. They ate in companionable silence, watching as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the land and turning the sky into a painter's palette of colors. "I've been thinking," Daniel said eventually, "about your situation." Adelaide tensed slightly. Was he about to suggest it was time for her to move on? The thought made her heart sink. "I received a letter from Elizabeth yesterday," he continued. "She's invited me to visit San Francisco next month for my nephew's birthday. I thought perhaps you might like to accompany me." "To San Francisco?" Adelaide was surprised. "Yes. Elizabeth knows many people there, respectable people who might be able to help you find a suitable position if that's still what you want." He hesitated. "Unless you're happy to stay at Silverline longer." Adelaide looked out at the view, considering. "I've been happier here than I expected to be," she admitted softly, "but I can't impose on your hospitality forever." "It's not an imposition," Daniel said quickly, turning to face her. "Adelaide, having you at Silverline these past weeks it's brought life back to the place. Mrs. Hathaway adores you, the Hands respect you, and I—" He trailed off, suddenly unsure. "And you?" she prompted gently, her heart beating faster. Daniel set down his wine cup and reached for her hand. "I find myself looking forward to seeing you each morning, to our rides, our conversations." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I never expected to feel this way again." Adelaide's breath caught. "Feel what way?" Instead of answering with words, Daniel leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Adelaide didn't want to pull away. She had been thinking about this moment, dreaming of it. She returned the kiss, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart beating as rapidly as her own. When they finally parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you, Adelaide Vale," he whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Why does it terrify you?" she asked, equally softly. "Because I never thought I would love again after Catherine died." Adelaide pulled back slightly to look at him. "Catherine," Daniel sighed, keeping hold of her hand. "My wife. We married just before the war. She died of fever while I was away fighting." "I'm so sorry," Adelaide said, understanding now some of the sadness she had occasionally glimpsed in his eyes. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but it changed me. I built Silverline partly to keep busy, to have purpose. I never expected to find someone who would make me feel again." Adelaide reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm falling in love with you too, Daniel Rowland," she confessed, "and it terrifies me as well for different reasons." "What reasons?" he asked, turning his head to kiss her palm. "Because when we met, I was at my lowest point. You saved me, and gratitude can sometimes be mistaken for deeper feelings." She held up a hand when he started to protest. "But I know my own heart, Daniel. What I feel for you goes far beyond gratitude." He smiled then, a smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "So where does that leave us? Perhaps," Adelaide suggested, "we could simply see where this leads. I'll accompany you to San Francisco and we'll take each day as it comes." Daniel nodded. "That seems wise." He hesitated. "But I want you to know that whatever happens, you always have a home at Silverline if you want it." They stayed on the hillside until the first stars appeared, talking of everything and nothing, sharing more kisses, and beginning to imagine a future they might build together. When they finally rode back to the ranch, something fundamental had shifted between them, a threshold crossed from friendship to something deeper, more profound. The next few weeks passed in a kind of golden haze for Adelaide. Her days were filled with work around the ranch helping Mrs. Hathaway with household duties, assisting Daniel with correspondence and bookkeeping, and continuing her riding lessons. But now, there were stolen kisses in the stables, lingering touches as they passed each other in the hallway, and long conversations on the porch in the evenings. Daniel was unfailingly respectful of her reputation, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but his eyes often followed her with a heat that made her blush. For her part, Adelaide discovered desires she had never acknowledged before, wanting to run her fingers through his son's streaked brown hair, to feel the strength of his arms around her, to know him in every way a woman could know a man. As their departure date for San Francisco approached, Adelaide found herself torn. Part of her was excited to visit the city, to see more of California beyond Randsburg and Silverline. But another part worried that something might change between them away from the ranch, that the bubble of happiness they had created might burst in the wider world. The night before they were due to leave, Daniel found her on the porch, staring up at the stars. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "I think so," she replied, "though I'm a little nervous about meeting your sister." "Elizabeth will adore you," Daniel assured her, taking her hand. "It's impossible not to." Adelaide smiled at that. "You're biased." "Completely," he agreed with a grin. "But it doesn't make it any less true." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whickers of horses in the stable, the chirping of crickets. "Daniel," Adelaide said eventually, "what happens if I don't find a position in San Francisco? Or if I do?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the window. "That depends on what you want, Adelaide. I meant what I said before. Silverline is your home for as long as you want it to be. And if what I want is to stay, not as your employee or your guest, but as something more," Daniel's hand tightened on hers. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Adelaide took a deep breath. "I'm saying that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. That I've fallen completely in love with you, with Silverline, with the life we might build here together." In one fluid movement, Daniel was kneeling before her chair, still holding her hand. "Adelaide Vale, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love again. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Adelaide's eyes, not tears of sorrow like those she had shed on the auction block, but tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Daniel Rowland." He pulled her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally separated, he was smiling so broadly it looked as though his face might split. "I don't have a ring yet," he apologized. "I was planning to look in San Francisco, but I hadn't intended to ask you quite so soon." Adelaide laughed. "I don't need a ring, I just need you. You have me," he promised, "now and always." They agreed to keep their engagement private until after their San Francisco trip, wanting to share the news with Elizabeth in person. The journey to the city took 3 days, first by wagon to Barstow, then by train the rest of the way. Adelaide had never traveled by railroad before and found the experience both terrifying and exhilarating. Daniel watched her delight with amusement as she pressed her nose to the window, exclaiming over every new sight. "You're like a child at Christmas," he teased. "Everything is so new," she replied unapologetically. "I've spent most of my life in cities, Daniel. The open country, the mountains, it's all so magnificent." His smile softened. "Seeing it through your eyes makes me appreciate it all over again." When they arrived in San Francisco, Adelaide was overwhelmed by the bustling energy of the city. Though smaller than Boston, where she had spent her childhood, it hummed with a vibrant, youthful spirit that was uniquely Californian. Elizabeth Rowland Carter's home was in a fashionable neighborhood, a handsome three-story building with bay windows and elaborate trim. She greeted them at the door herself, a tall, slender woman with the same blue eyes as Daniel and a warm smile. "Daniel, finally!" she exclaimed, embracing her brother before turning to Adelaide. "And you must be Miss Vale. Daniel's letters have told me so much about you." Adelaide smiled, immediately liking Daniel's sister. "All good things, I hope." "Nothing but," Elizabeth assured her, leading them inside. "Come in, come in." The children are beside themselves with excitement about Uncle Daniel's visit. Daniel's nephew James, the birthday boy, was turning 8 and his sister Margaret was 5. Both children flung themselves at their uncle the moment they saw him, and he scooped them up in his strong arms, laughing as they peppered him with questions. Elizabeth's husband Thomas was a successful attorney, cultured and well-read, with a dry wit that reminded Adelaide somewhat of Daniel. They welcomed her warmly into their home, never once hinting at curiosity about her unusual arrival at Silverline. That evening, after the children had been put to bed, the adults gathered in the parlor for brandy and conversation. Adelaide found herself relaxing, enjoying the civilized atmosphere and the easy banter between Daniel and his family. "Daniel tells me you're an excellent bookkeeper, Miss Vale," Thomas remarked. "You know, my law firm is actually in need of someone to manage our accounts. If you're interested in employment while in San Francisco, I'd be happy to introduce you to my partners." Adelaide glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Carter," she replied. "But actually—" She looked at Daniel again, receiving a slight smile in return. "We have some news to share." Elizabeth set down her brandy glass, her eyes widening. "News?" Daniel reached for Adelaide's hand. "I've asked Adelaide to marry me, and to my eternal good fortune she has accepted." There was a moment of surprised silence. Then Elizabeth let out a delighted laugh and rushed to embrace them both. "Oh, this is wonderful! Daniel, I've been telling you for years that you needed someone to share Silverline with you." Thomas shook Daniel's hand warmly. "Congratulations to you both. This calls for champagne, not brandy." As Thomas went to fetch the champagne, Elizabeth settled beside Adelaide on the sofa. "I'm so happy for you both," she said sincerely. "When Daniel wrote about meeting you, there was something different in his letters, a lightness I hadn't seen since before Catherine." "He's told me about her," Adelaide said. "She must have been very special." "She was," Elizabeth agreed, "and losing her so young while he was away at war. It nearly destroyed him. For years afterward, he was just going through the motions of living." She squeezed Adelaide's hand. "But the way he looks at you, that's a man who's found his heart again." Thomas returned with the champagne, and they toasted the engagement. As the evening wore on, they talked of wedding plans, of life at Silverline, of the future Adelaide and Daniel hoped to build together. Later, as Daniel walked Adelaide to her room, Elizabeth being a proper hostess who had given them separate accommodations, he pulled her into a quiet alcove for a moment of privacy. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face in the dim light. "Happier than I've ever been," she assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Your family is wonderful." "They're your family now, too," he reminded her, "or they will be soon." Adelaide liked the sound of that family, something she had thought lost to her forever after her parents' deaths. "When shall we marry?" she asked, her hands resting on his chest. "As soon as possible," Daniel replied promptly. "Unless you want a grand wedding with all the trimmings," Adelaide shook her head. "I just want you. We could marry here in San Francisco before we return home if your sister wouldn't mind." "Home," Daniel repeated, smiling. "I like hearing you call Silverline home." "It is home," she said simply. "You are home." The rest of their time in San Francisco passed in a blur of activity. Elizabeth, delighted at the prospect of helping plan a wedding, threw herself into the arrangements with enthusiasm. They chose a simple but elegant dress for Adelaide from one of the city's finest shops. Daniel purchased a plain gold band from a jeweler on Market Street, and Elizabeth arranged for the ceremony to be held in her garden with a small reception to follow. The day of the wedding dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze blowing in from the bay. Adelaide stood at the window of her room, looking out at the garden where chairs had been arranged in neat rows and flowers festooned every available surface. A knock at the door heralded Elizabeth's arrival, carrying a small box. "Something borrowed," she explained, opening it to reveal a delicate pearl necklace. "This was our mother's. Daniel wanted you to wear it today." Adelaide touched the pearls reverently. "They're beautiful. Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Here, let me help you put it on." Elizabeth fastened the necklace around Adelaide's neck, then stepped back to admire the effect. "Perfect. You look beautiful, Adelaide." The ceremony itself was intimate, just Daniel's family, a few close friends of the Carters, and a minister from the church Elizabeth attended. But as Adelaide walked down the makeshift aisle toward Daniel, seeing the love shining in his eyes, she couldn't have wished for anything more elaborate. Their vows were simple and heartfelt. Daniel promised to cherish her all the days of his life, to be her partner in all things, to ensure that his first words to her as a free woman, that she would only know joy from that moment on, would prove true. Adelaide promised to stand by his side through whatever life might bring, to be his equal partner in building their future, to fill Silverline with love and laughter. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed her with such tenderness that Adelaide felt tears spring to her eyes. The small gathering of guests applauded, and little Margaret Carter tossed rose petals around them with gleeful abandon. The reception was equally lovely, a luncheon in the Carters' dining room, with champagne flowing freely, and toasts offered to the happy couple's future. As the afternoon wore on, Adelaide found herself watching Daniel as he chatted with his brother-in-law, thinking how fortunate she was to have found such a man. "He looks happier than I've seen him in years," Elizabeth commented, coming to stand beside her. "You've brought him back to life, Adelaide." "He did the same for me," Adelaide replied softly. "When he found me, I had lost all hope." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "Then you were meant to find each other." They left San Francisco the next day, beginning the journey back to Silverline as husband and wife. The return trip seemed faster somehow, perhaps because they were eager to begin their new life together. When they arrived at the ranch, they were greeted by a surprise Mrs. Hathaway, and the ranch hands had decorated the house with wildflowers and ribbons, and a banner over the door read, "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Rowland." How did they know? Adelaide wondered, delighted by the gesture. Daniel grinned. "I may have sent a telegram from San Francisco." That night, alone in what was now their bedroom, Adelaide discovered the final joy of marriage, the physical expression of their love. Daniel was a gentle, considerate lover, mindful of her inexperience but thorough in his attentions. In his arms, she found a passion she had never known existed, a communion of bodies and souls that left her breathless with wonder. After, as they lay tangled together beneath the sheets, Daniel traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happy, Mrs. Rowland," he murmured. "Beyond words," she replied, nestling closer to him. "And you? I never thought I could be this happy again," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You've given me back something I thought was lost forever." Adelaide smiled in the darkness. "Then we're even, because you did the same for me the day you stopped that auction." Life at Silverline settled into a new rhythm after their marriage. Adelaide took on more responsibilities around the ranch, not just with the household accounts but with some of the business decisions as well. Her keen mind and education proved valuable assets, and Daniel always treated her as a full partner in their enterprise. Their days were filled with work, their evenings with conversation and increasingly passionate lovemaking. Adelaide bloomed under Daniel's love and protection, growing more confident in her new role as a rancher's wife. She learned to ride like a true Westerner, to shoot a rifle for protection, to negotiate with the cattle buyers who came to Silverline. 3 months after their wedding, Daniel had to travel to Los Angeles on business. It was the first time they had been separated since their marriage, and Adelaide found herself missing him desperately during the week he was gone. On the day of his expected return, she rode out to meet him, spotting his familiar figure on horseback as he crested a hill on Silverline property. He saw her at the same moment, and his face broke into a wide smile as he urged his horse into a gallop to reach her sooner. "There's my beautiful wife," he called as he drew near, "the best sight in all of California." Adelaide laughed as he swung down from his saddle and pulled her into his arms for a passionate kiss. "I've missed you," she said when they finally parted. "Not half as much as I've missed you," he replied, his hand still at her waist. "Never again. Next time you're coming with me, business be damned." They rode back to the ranch together, Daniel telling her about his successful negotiations in Los Angeles, Adelaide filling him in on the happenings at Silverline during his absence. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel's arm around Adelaide's shoulders. "I have something to tell you," she said, turning to face him. "Something wonderful." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Adelaide took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "We're going to have a baby." His eyes widened, then filled with such joy that Adelaide felt her own eyes welling with happy tears. "A baby? Are you certain?" She nodded. "Dr. Miller confirmed it while you were away. The baby should arrive in early spring." Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Adelaide Rowland, you continue to make me the happiest man alive," he whispered against her hair. The months that followed were filled with preparations. Daniel insisted on hiring additional help for the household so Adelaide wouldn't strain herself, and he spent his evenings crafting a cradle for the baby from the finest wood he could find. Mrs. Hathaway busied herself knitting tiny garments and offering Adelaide all the folk wisdom about pregnancy she had accumulated over a lifetime. As Adelaide's body changed to accommodate their growing child, Daniel's love and desire for her only seemed to increase. He marveled at the miracle taking place within her, treating her with a reverence that sometimes made her laugh. "I'm not made of porcelain, Daniel," she would remind him when he tried to prevent her from doing the simplest tasks. "Humor me," he would reply with a smile. "It's my first time at this." Winter came and went. The new year of 1876 arrived, and Adelaide's time drew near. Daniel grew increasingly anxious as the due date approached, having sent for a skilled midwife from San Bernardino to attend the birth. On a clear March morning, Adelaide's labor began. Daniel hovered anxiously until Mrs. Hathaway and the midwife shooed him from the bedroom, telling him sternly that pacing would not help matters. For hours, he waited in the sitting room downstairs, jumping at every sound from above, until finally the cry of a newborn pierced the quiet house. Minutes later, Mrs. Hathaway appeared at the top of the stairs, beaming. "Mr. Rowland, you have a son, a strong, healthy boy. Mother and child are doing beautifully." Daniel took the stairs 2 at a time, rushing to Adelaide's side. She was propped up against the pillows, tired but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," she said softly as Daniel approached the bed with reverent steps. He sat beside her, gazing in wonder at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, Daniel caught a glimpse of deep blue. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "Just like his mother." Adelaide smiled, leaning against Daniel's shoulder. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names during her pregnancy, but hadn't settled on any. Now, looking at his son's face, Daniel knew. "Thomas, after my father," he suggested. "Thomas James Rowland, if you like." "Thomas James Rowland," Adelaide repeated, testing the name. "It suits him perfectly." Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For our son, for our life together, for everything." Little Thomas thrived, growing into a happy, healthy baby who delighted his parents with each new milestone: his first smile, his first laugh, the first time he rolled over. Daniel proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Thomas around the ranch in a sling while he went about his work, telling the infant all about the cattle, the horses, the land that would one day be his. Adelaide watched them together with a full heart, marveling at how completely her life had changed in just over a year. From the depths of despair on that auction block in Randsburg to the heights of joy as a wife and mother at Silverline, it seemed almost impossible. One evening, as she sat on a blanket beneath an oak tree near the house, watching Daniel teach Thomas to pet a patient old ranch dog, Adelaide was struck by a memory. Daniel, standing tall and determined on that auction platform, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists, saying words that had seemed too simple, too optimistic at the time. "From now on, you'll only know joy." He had kept that promise. Despite the normal challenges of life, the occasional disagreements, the worry over a drought that threatened their cattle, the exhaustion of new parenthood, joy had indeed been the overwhelming theme of their life together. Daniel looked up, catching her watching them. He smiled, that special smile that still made her heart skip a beat, and carried Thomas over to join her on the blanket. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked, settling beside her. "About the day we met," she replied honestly. "About how far we've come." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I hadn't gone into Randsburg that day." "But you did," Adelaide said, taking his hand. "And you saved me." "We saved each other," he corrected gently, kissing her knuckles. "I was half alive before you came to Silverline, just going through the motions. You brought the light back." Thomas, bored with the adult conversation, began to babble happily, reaching for a wildflower growing at the edge of the blanket. Daniel plucked it for him, then gathered another to tuck behind Adelaide's ear. "I love you, Adelaide Rowland," he said simply. "More each day." "And I love you," she replied, "for all my days." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the little family made their way back to the house, Daniel carrying Thomas, his free arm around Adelaide's waist. The lanterns in the windows of Silverline glowed warmly, beckoning them home. Adelaide paused for a moment to look back at the land stretching out behind them, the peaceful pastures, the distant hills, the beauty of the California wilderness. This was her home now, this land and the man beside her. From the darkest day of her life had come the greatest blessing, a love that had healed them both, a family built on respect and devotion, a future filled with promise. "What is it?" Daniel asked, noticing her pause. Adelaide turned to him with a smile, her heart full. "Just thinking that you were right, all those months ago." "About what?" "That from that day forward I would only know joy." Daniel pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That was a promise I intend to keep for all our days together." With their son between them and the lights of home ahead, they walked toward the house, leaving the shadows of the past behind them, embracing the joy that had found them against all odds in the wild lands of the West. 5 years later, Silverline Ranch had prospered beyond even Daniel's ambitious dreams. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Thomas had been joined by a sister, Elizabeth Catherine, now 3, and Adelaide was expecting their third child in the autumn. The town of Randsburg had changed too, growing more civilized as law and order gradually established themselves across the West. Daniel and Adelaide occasionally visited for supplies or business, and while some people still remembered the auction that had brought them together, it was now spoken of in hushed, embarrassed tones, a shameful remnant of a rougher time. On the anniversary of the day they had met, Daniel always took Adelaide riding to the hillside where they had shared their first sunset picnic. It had become a tradition, a way to honor the beginning of their journey together. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked as they sat side by side, watching the familiar golden light spread across their land. At 30, she was even more beautiful than when they had met, her face softened by motherhood, her eyes bright with contentment. "Regret what?" Daniel asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Spending all that money to buy my freedom, taking in a complete stranger." Daniel laughed, the sound still her favorite in the world. "That's like asking if I regret breathing," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Best decision I ever made." Adelaide leaned into him, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach where their third child grew. "I used to think happiness like this didn't exist," she confessed, "that it was just something in storybooks. And now—" She smiled up at him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Now I know that sometimes the stories get it right." As the sun set on another day at Silverline, Daniel and Adelaide Rowland turned their horses toward home, toward their children waiting eagerly for their return, toward the life they had built together from the most unlikely of beginnings, a life of purpose, prosperity, and above all, the joy that Daniel had promised on that fateful day when he first took Adelaide's hand and changed both their destinies forever.